Hey everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host Michael. On a Friday, I wanted to review a video that came out earlier today, a discussion on the Society of St. Pius X by Erick Sammons and also James Vogel, who's the Director of Communications in the U.S. District for the Society of St. Pius X. And Erick Sammons is the Editor-in-Chief for Crisis Magazine. This was on Crisis Magazine YouTube website. In fact, I include a link to the full video if you would like to watch it. What I'll do is I'll speak about various timestamps, but I'm only going to play certain selective portions. I'm not going to play the entire thing or a whole bunch of clips. I'll offer some various commentary on different timestamps, but what I will do is play two key clips and comment on them, and then briefly show a video of the Society of St. Pius X to confirm what I'm saying. Now, I've done, in-depth content already on the Society of St. Pius X. I have a SSPX playlist where you can go and see some of that already, where I've interviewed John Salza, who used to frequent SSPX chapels for quite a long time. Interviewed him on the subject. I've also done presentations on it myself where I've expressed some concerns about the SSPX. Unfortunately, neither anything that Salza has said nor I have said has really been sufficiently engaged yet. Hopefully that will come. With this video, unfortunately, I didn't see any kind of grappling with some of the weightier criticisms of the SSPX. It was more just your standard general apologetic for the Society of St. Pius X that was very, very surface level, and again did not address the more substantive critiques that have been made against the SSPX. So hopefully something will come eventually, but I haven't seen it so far. But if you want to see those more substantive critiques, certainly check out the video that I've done in the SSPX playlist here on this channel, or the video that John Salza recently did on Pints with Aquinas, over 3 hours, where he engages the SSPX and also sedevacantism, still unanswered, as I said. I will say that, at the outset, I appreciated the demeanor of James Vogel, the person who's defending the SSPX here in this video. I appreciated his demeanor. I've spoken to James before personally. I found him to be a really pleasant person to talk to. And so he's the kind of guy I feel like you can have a fruitful conversation with, in my experience. And he seemed the same on the video, seemed like a pretty agreeable person that you can really have a good discussion with. And I also appreciate Erick Sammons in the video, because Erick in multiple instances did challenge some of the points of the SSPX and proposed some of those challenges to James. So I appreciated the fact that Erick was doing his best to offer some probing questions, and James was also willing to come on and publicly answer some of those things. I do think that some more probing and deeper questions could have been asked. It tended to be, again, your more surface level and questions that have already been addressed, and the more substantive claims weren't really proposed and addressed. And so I do think a deeper job could have been done when it comes to challenging the SSPX here. But at the very least, I still appreciate Erick, doing his best to do that. So let me give you some other brief thoughts before I actually start engaging with specific timestamps. One of the things that I noticed in the video is the fact that the Society of St. Pius X, as I've demonstrated, and as we will see towards the end of the video, the SSPX says even the Novus Ordo, when it's properly celebrated, not liturgical abuses, but properly celebrated, in other words, the best expression of the Novus Ordo, they maintain it's, quote, an offense to God, end quote, as we'll see here in a moment, and as I've, again, shown elsewhere. Stuff like that wasn't addressed, and that's unfortunate. More of the softball critiques against the SSPX was addressed. But stuff like that, you don't hear any engagement with. And that's where I really want to see some engagement. How can one claim that the Novus Ordo, even celebrated properly, is an offense to God? Because that would then indicate that a liturgy that the church has universally promulgated, and I say universally here, not because it's for all rights in the church, in all sui juris jurisdictions, but simply put, universally, because the vast majority of the world is made up of Roman Rite Catholics. And so, in that sense, I'm speaking of a universal promulgation of a liturgy. Here you have the claim that a liturgy that the church has universally promulgated is an offense to God. And I want to say that does violence to our claims of indefectibility and the holiness and liturgy of the church, as I've demonstrated again elsewhere. And I didn't see a sufficient grappling with that. In fact, it wasn't brought up at all. So this is why I'm saying some of the more severe criticisms of the Society of St. Pius X weren't raised, let alone addressed. Another point, and that is the SSPX's view on Novus Ordo confessions, which again I've addressed in the playlist. There is a very, very dangerous position there. The SSPX has officially stated, as I've demonstrated, that it's really best not to go to Novus Ordo confessions, to just, if you are in grave sin, it's best not to go to Novus Ordo confession. It's best to just hold off and wait until you can get to a traditional priest. That raises some very, very serious and troubling concerns for people who do have the availability of the sacrament in their territory, who are not availing themselves of the sacrament because of very, very harmful advice from the SSPX. Again, that wasn't raised, neither responded to. Other things, like the more bombastic claims of Lefebvre, weren't raised or addressed. Let me give you some examples here. And believe me, there are plenty of others. And this is the stuff, by the way, that started opening my eyes to the SSPX, because used to I was a lot more friendly to the SSPX position and thesis until I started seeing stuff like this. Then I had to say, wait, we got to pump the brakes on this. There's some serious problems here. So this, among many other concerns. Let me read something to you from Yves Congar. This is his work, Challenge to the Church, the Case of Archbishop Lefebvre. Here he says, in another instance, during an interview with the Italian weekly Europeo, he said, that is Lefebvre, quote, "It is not I who have activated a schism. It's the Church of Rome, the Church of the Council, which has separated itself from Christ," end quote. Full stop. He's saying Rome is in schism from Christ. Vatican II is in schism. This isn't just a critique of, hey, I have some disagreements with some non-definitive teachings of Vatican II. That would be one thing. This is something else. Vatican II is in schism from Christ. Rome is in schism from Christ. That's exactly the opposite of how schism is defined, which, to his credit, James properly gave the definition of schism in the video. But then I don't know if he's not aware, but doesn't really connect the dots, that Lefebvre was not operating with that definition when he says things like Rome is in schism. I'm not in schism, it's Rome. That sounds like something Luther could say as well. I'm not the one who abandoned the gospel, it's Rome who has. I'm not in schism, it's Rome. I'm not excommunicated, Rome's excommunicated. It's a very troubling quote, which I've never seen denied from the SSPX. If it's out there, please let me know. He goes on, and at Laon on the 29th of August, 1976, he declared, quote, "We are not in a state of schism, for it is we who continue the Catholic Church. It is those who carry out the reforms who are in a state of schism," end quote. Again, I have not heard this repudiated by the SSPX. If it has been, please let me know, because he's directly quoting him, giving names, dates, places, saying it's Rome who's in schism, not me, and it's me who continues the Catholic Church. No, absolutely not. Again, that goes against the indefectibility of the Catholic Church. It's Rome who preserves the faith, not Lefebvre. There are a million Eastern Orthodox who would agree with Lefebvre here and would express this very view of ecclesiology. They'll say they're not in a state of schism. It's we, the Eastern Orthodox, who continue the Catholic Church, not Rome. But wait, it's always been Catholic ecclesiology to say, no, it's Rome that preserves sacred tradition and is indefectible in its teachings. Going back, go to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, Pope Agatho's letter to the Emperor, accepted by the Ecumenical Council, accepted by the Eastern Fathers. He clearly notes Rome in its teaching office, that is Pope Agatho, and the Council accepted it. Rome is indefectible in its teaching office. Why? Because of the promise of Christ in the Gospel of Matthew and also Luke. So the ecclesiology that I'm hearing from Lefebvre here is not Catholic. It's contrary to Catholicism. Those are the more substantive critiques of Lefebvre that I would like to hear addressed. And believe me, those are just a couple quotes. There's many, many others. Lefebvre did what he did as far as the illicit consecrations because he believed that it was up to him to continue the faith. If he didn't carry out these illicit consecrations, the faith would not be preserved. That was Lefebvre's view. But is that a Catholic ecclesiology? That it's Lefebvre who continues the church, not Rome? Absolutely not. It is Catholic ecclesiology that Rome will not fail, and Rome carries out the faith. So stuff like that, I want to see that grappled with. If there's some legitimate answers and responses from the SSPX to that, that would relieve some of my concerns. That would make me feel a whole lot better. But when I've raised these concerns and others have raised these concerns and there's crickets on the other end, you wonder, are there responses from the SSPX to this stuff? I don't know. But we didn't get that from this video, unfortunately. Now, at one point in the video, it is admitted by Vogel, again representing the SSPX as the U.S. Director of Communications for the SSPX. He admits early on that they are in an irregular situation. But my problem here is we're not just speaking about whether the SSPX is in an irregular situation. Rome has explicitly says that those who formally adhere to the schism are not in full communion. Those who formally adhere to the schism of the SSPX are not in full communion. It's not talking about just somebody who frequents an SSPX chapel. That's not somebody who necessarily formally adheres. But for somebody who does formally adhere to the schism of the SSPX, the Vatican has said they're not in full communion. So this is not just an issue of regularizing someone's communion. I mean, that's part of it. But also, it's still Rome's position that if you formally adhere to it, you're in schism and you're not in full communion. That has to be grappled with. One needs to demonstrate why that is no longer true. And yet, it is still true from Rome's perspective. Obviously, the society is going to disagree, but it just kind of reminds me, from Rome's perspective, Martin Luther was excommunicated, but Martin Luther maintained until the day he died that he was still Catholic. Well, just because Luther still thought he wasn't excommunicated and burned the bull excommunicating him doesn't mean he wasn't still excommunicated, because at the end of the day, it's what Rome thinks on the matter that really is of consequence. And what Rome says is it's still officially the position. If you formally adhere to this, you're in schism and you're not in full communion. That has to be engaged. And everything that we've heard in response to it, well, Pope Francis has grand faculties. You have this, you have that. There's a letter written saying that you could actually attend SSPX in certain cases. None of that takes away from the fact that if you still formally adhere to it, you're in schism. And I've raised this many times. Salza has, others have, and we just hear crickets. So instead, we get responses to questions that aren't really the burning questions. Now, at the 22-minute mark, let's start to talk about specific timestamps. There's a refutation of a straw man concerning obedience to superiors that I hear constantly. Kwasniewski's name was brought up. This was Erick Sammons, who brings up, the issue of obedience, and he notes that there are some exceptions to obedience, and he just strawmans it. I don't know anybody who is saying that obedience to the church and papacy is without qualification. I know nobody who takes that position. If they're out there, please let me know, and I'd be happy to critique them. But to my knowledge, they don't exist. Nobody is saying there's an unqualified obedience to Rome. But what we're saying is the qualifications to obedience of Rome would be if Rome commands you to do something sinful. Rome never commanded Lefebvre to do anything sinful. Ergo, it doesn't logically follow that he was being obedient. Or it doesn't logically follow that he wasn't being disobedient with illicit consecrations. Now, it would logically follow if Lefebvre is right that it's up to him to maintain the faith. Unless he goes through with consecrations, the church is somehow going to be destroyed. Yeah, if that's true, then absolutely he had every right to disobey the papacy. But isn't that already a defective ecclesiology that one has to adopt to even take that position? Right. So can't take that position. So whenever we bring this question of obedience up, and people bring up exceptions, those exceptions are never applicable to the situation. What did Rome demand of Lefebvre that was somehow sinful? Everything Rome demanded of Lefebvre was within Rome's authority to demand. So if there was disobedience on Lefebvre's part, it was sinful and cannot be justified. And to Erick's credit, at one point, as I'll mention later on, to Erick's credit, he notes that, hey, I don't really agree with Lefebvre with these consecrations. I think that he should have, cooperated more with the process from Rome. I just don't see any other way than this being disobedient. To his credit, he mentioned that, and I appreciated that. But I still heard some straw manning of the obedience critique. Now, at the 27-minute, 30-second mark, this is just kind of rough, right around that timestamp. Vogel says that Rome gave Lefebvre permission to consecrate a bishop, but things broke down on the dates, communication and agreement broke down on dates. So Lefebvre proceeded with consecrations due to the responsibility that he felt he had for the church. I want to note multiple things. Number one, yes, Rome had agreed to one bishop. One. How many did he consecrate? 4. So that's not the same thing, right? Rome agreed to one bishop that it would have a say in ratifying as far as who it was. Well, Lefebvre completely bypassed that. And so he not only consecrated a bishop that Rome had not approved of, he consecrated 4 of them. And that's not really brought out. It's just brought out that, Rome had already agreed to give him a bishop. So what he did isn't really that bad because it had already agreed in theory to give him a bishop. Yeah, conditioned on Rome choosing who it was and not 4 of them. So that still doesn't take away from the disobedience aspect. It still doesn't take away from the schism aspect. Not to mention, he was formally, canonically warned not to go through with the consecrations of not just 1, but 4. Not to go through with them, he still went through with them. So it still doesn't take away from the charge that this was an act of schism. We're not talking about whether or not Lefebvre's personally, sinfully guilty of schism. We're not getting into that question. That's irrelevant. I don't know. I don't know if he had mitigating circumstances. I'm not asking that question. I'm just dealing with, objectively speaking, was this an act of schism? According to Rome, yes. And that wasn't grappled with sufficiently. And I would moreover ask, what responsibility did Lefebvre have that allowed him to disobey an official canonical warning from Rome to not go through with these illicit consecrations and to do a schismatic act? What responsibility for the church did he have? Because Vogel says he had this responsibility. What responsibility was that? Was it a responsibility to somehow preserve the faith? As if sacred tradition wouldn't be preserved apart from Lefebvre? What responsibility? The fact of the matter is there was no responsibility that Lefebvre had at the time that would justify these actions. And again, I didn't hear a sufficient grappling with that. There also wasn't, sufficient pushback on that point as well. Now, later on, 28-minute and 22nd stamp, Vogel notes that Lefebvre did not see the illicit consecrations that he went through with as an act of disobedience. That's true. Lefebvre did not see them as an act of disobedience. You can read basically a sermon at the time of these acts, and he feels justified in these schismatic actions or act. He felt justified. He felt he had reasons for this. And that is, again, because he felt that it's up to him to preserve the faith. But again, a defective ecclesiology is at the heart of that position. So I have to say we as Catholics can't accept that. So what else would justify him to do this? And yes, sure, he may have thought that he had to go through with this. He may have thought that he wasn't being disobedient. He may have thought it wasn't an act of schism. That doesn't mean anything objectively. I can think I'm not wrong and be wrong all day long. I imagine there's some people watching this video that think I'm wrong about the SSPX. Okay, well, guess what? I don't think I'm wrong about the SSPX. Does that mean anything to you? Probably not, because you're probably going to still say I'm wrong about the SSPX. So you recognize there's a difference between what I think and what is objectively true, right? So same thing here. Doesn't matter what Lefebvre thought, unless we're just asking the question, is there a mitigation and culpability or something? But that's not the question. Nobody's, to my knowledge, asking, was he somehow a sinner or immortal sin? I don't know anybody who's asking that. The question is, was this a schismatic act? Not what is his personal culpability? I don't want to address that one. I'd leave that up to God. But objectively speaking, the act was wrong. I mean, again, like I said, Martin Luther maintained until the day he died that he was right, that he had the gospel, that he was in the true church, that he was still a Catholic, that he wasn't excommunicated by the Church of Christ. He maintained that until the day he died, but he was still wrong. So, I mean, Lefebvre maintained a certain position, but it seems that he was wrong. And I would love to hear some interaction from the SSPX explaining otherwise. Okay. Now, let's play a short clip here from the 30-minute or so mark until around 36 minutes. And let me interact with that. I'm going to share my screen. Enable audio. And let's begin.
Was it June or July of
June 30th, 1988.
Okay, June 30th, 1988. He goes ahead and consecrates 4 priests as bishops. And by that act, John Paul II, of course, the Pope at that time, essentially says that Lefebvre and the 4 men who were consecrated bishops are excommunicated. And so one thing I always want to make sure these things are clear for people is nobody ever disputes that these were invalid consecrations. By that, we mean that these men who were consecrated bishops are actually bishops. The question is whether or not they have any jurisdiction, whether or not they're because they're not approved by the Pope, illicit, and issues like that. So,
and whether or not there remains a schism because of the operation of priests and bishops who are illicitly consecrated. That as well.
Just again, that's a really extreme measure. I mean, I've said this publicly before that I have sympathies with the SSPX, never actually attended a chapel, never even met an SSPX priest. You're one of the few people I've actually talked to who attend SSPX. Sure. But at the same time,
and let me throw my hat in the ring. I also have some sympathies with the SSPX. I do. I also have some sympathies with Martin Luther against the abuses of indulgences. So, I mean, I can have sympathies with somebody and still substantially disagree with them.
All that being said, I cannot see that action as anything but wrong in the sense of on my reading of it, it seems like he should have been more patient. Now I know.
And hats off to Erick Sammons for saying that. I appreciate him saying that and also challenging James here in the SSPX's position here. I appreciate that. That's my position as well. I think that there's a lot of things that you can kind of understand Lefebvre where he's coming from. He's seeing chaos going on. He's hearing all kinds of craziness from some prelates. You can understand his frustration. You can also understand why he had a heightened sense that he has a duty to preserve a good training for priests and things like that. I can completely understand that. But at the end of the day, does any of that justify a schismatic act and illicit consecration of bishops? The answer is no. The answer is no. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not up to Lefebvre to save the church.
No, 2020 hindsight is 2020. But there was I feel like if you wait a little bit longer, even a few more months or even a year, it would have revealed whether or not the Vatican really was going to allow it or not.
And the Vatican was going to. Read the exchange between Ratzinger and Lefebvre, the back and forth. It's clear who broke the agreement. There was an agreement on Lefebvre's part. He broke the agreement. Not only that, he changed the entire situation. Rome was discussing one bishop with him. He all of a sudden says, "No, I want 4." It's Lefebvre who's aggravating the situation, and it's Lefebvre who ultimately says, "I'm not going to wait any longer. You guys are saying, okay, here's the date, but then we're rescheduling it for this or that reason. So I just feel that you're never going to do this, so I'm just going to go ahead and do with it because you're not giving me a date." That doesn't justify those actions. And it was clear that Rome was being sincere. Just read the correspondences. So it's clear who jumped the gun. It's clear who broke with the agreements between Rome and Lefebvre. And that was, unfortunately, Lefebvre. Again, that becomes very apparent from the exchanges of letters that you can find on the SSPX website. Just go to the SSPX website where it has the back and forth between Ratzinger and Lefebvre, and you read that and you just think, gosh, Lefebvre was in the wrong here. Yeah, Rome could have done a better job. Absolutely. Nobody's questioning that. But did Rome do anything that would justify Lefebvre illicitly consecrating bishops and performing a schismatic act? No, not at all.
Because I think his position, and I've heard this from a lot, from reading and stuff, is that he realized they're just playing games. They're never gonna approve it. So how would you respond to like my concerns that it just seems like it wasn't?
But there wasn't justifiable reason to feel that they were playing games. There was no justifiable reason for it. Not to mention that doesn't then justify 4 bishops instead of 1. So it's clear who's aggravating the situation here and who's introducing doubt into the situation.
An act of disobedience, the actual consecrations.
So I think you're right to say it's a momentous thing, and I think it can only be seen in the context of Archbishop Lefebvre looking at the situation in the church and the situation with the Society of St. Pius X as sufficiently grave as to justify the possibility of doing that.
What would allow for a schismatic act? What would be so grave to allow for that? Nothing. Unless it's, okay, well, we have to preserve the faith because Rome isn't going to preserve the faith. So unless we continue a line of bishops here, the church itself is going to be lost. But again, that's a defective ecclesiology. So we can't use that as the answer. So what is the answer here? We all agree that there was a grave situation both then and now. We all agree there. That's not in dispute. But is it grave enough to justify an act of schism? Now, obviously, Lefebvre and SSPX is going to say, well, he wasn't actually engaging in an act of schism. There's a state of necessity, blah, 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 blah. But ultimately, it's up to Rome to determine whether or not this is an act of schism. It's up to Rome to interpret canon law. Rome, that is the Pope, is the ultimate interpreter of canon law, not Lefebvre, not the SSPX. And that's in canon law itself. It's Rome who interprets it officially, not Icona or somebody else saying, I get to interpret this over against the person who actually promulgates the code of canon law.
As far as the timing goes, I mean, it already had been a question, right? It was already something. I mean, Archbishop Lefebvre had been talking about resolving the situation of the society and the consecration of bishops being part of that discussion for years already. It really, I mean, there's an apostolic visit again at the end of 1987. This is Cardinal Gagnon, and he gives what is apparently a very favorable report. He even, I think we like to kind of point out, he assisted at Archbishop Lefebvre's mass at a cone. So yeah, Archbishop Lefebvre suspended, but apostolic visitor from Rome, is assisting there. I mean, really, it went very
bizarre.
well. It's a little bizarre, but this gives Archbishop Lefebvre some hope at the end of the year. Like, okay, well, maybe there is actually going to be some solution, and that's what leads really directly into the discussions. I mean, there's other steps, but that's what leads to the discussions with Cardinal Ratzinger at the time. So, yes, I mean, I guess there's no way of ever knowing. Could he have waited another month? Would it have resolved if he waited till August?
You don't have to know that to know it was a schismatic act, though. That's the point. You don't have to know, because it still doesn't justify the act.
I mean, he certainly got to the point where he thought, look, it's not. Again, I'm not trying to put words in his mouth. I think you can read from his letters and talks at the time that for him, it's sufficiently dangerous for me not to wait anymore, especially when, again,
and Martin Luther also thought it was sufficiently dangerous for him to not do what he did. Now, I'm not saying that there's an absolute comparison between Lefebvre and Luther. No, I think that Luther was way worse. But the analogy here is, but Luther also thought that he was justified in some actions of his against the church because he thought that the situation was grave enough. And we all recognize, no, that doesn't allow Luther to do it. Well, same applies to Lefebvre.
For his, you don't really have to agree with him so far as even canon law, for instance, admits that, there's no personal culpability. If you feel like you're acting out of a state of necessity.
But that's not the question. Nobody's asking, to my knowledge, whether or not Lefebvre is personally culpable. I assume the best. That's my position. You might assume the worst. I assume that there were mitigating circumstances in light of the fact that he was just seeing chaos around him. That's what I assume. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but again, I would rather assume that than assume, that somebody is morally culpable for schism. But that's not the question. That's irrelevant. The point is, however, is the act itself schismatic? And is the act itself justifiable? And appealing to canon law to say there might be mitigating circumstances personally, that doesn't remove the fact that, however, the act itself is still schismatic. And it's ultimately Rome, by the way, again, that determines the meaning and interpretation of canon law. And Rome says this was schismatic. It formally warned him in advance, canonically warned him in advance. He received it, and he still went through with it. It is what it is.
For the Archbishop, he's like, look, they're willing to give me a bishop in principle. We're haggling over the date. We're haggling over, who that bishop may be, but not that he ever made this, I don't think, explicit. But I think it's only in the 1950s that Pius XII makes it an automatic. I mean, so again, when you say excommunicated, if a bishop consecrates a bishop without papal mandate under canon law, it's a latae sententiae excommunications, automatic, like a self-imposed, like you did this thing. You don't even need a formal decree announcing it. So I think that,
which Rome, however, still the very next day came out and formally said he had been automatically excommunicated. So it authoritatively assessed the situation and formally said the automatic excommunication has gone through. Very next day, Ecclesia Dei Afflicta.
That starts in the 1950s under Pius XII with the Chinese Patriotic Church, because, that was a parallel church, and that's clearly not what Archbishop Lefebvre is doing here. So he really does go to.
You don't have to create a parallel church to still, however, create a perform a schismatic act.
Great lengths to point out, I'm not conferring jurisdiction. These are not.
Irrelevant. Doesn't matter if you're maintaining that you're conferring jurisdiction, it's still a schismatic act.
Not bishops with territorial jurisdiction. They are auxiliaries. And I do think it's easier for us. Well, now we do have the benefit of hindsight and saying, I mean, it is not a parallel church. So
irrelevant. Rome still came out and authoritatively said this was a schismatic act and calls it a schism, regardless of whether or not he thought he was conferring jurisdiction. Irrelevant. And this is one of my concerns. I'm hearing a sidestepping of the issue. I imagine it's not intentional. I don't think that James is intentionally trying to sidestep the issue. But what I'm saying is it's a sidestepping of the issue because perhaps a failure to grasp the ultimate critique against SSPX. I don't know. The more substantive critiques, maybe he's not considering those. But a more substantive critique is going to point out, but Rome still says this is schismatic, and it's ultimately Rome who determines whenever this penalty has gone into effect, not the individual. Rome determines that, and Rome determined it here, recognizing that Lefebvre wasn't trying to say that he is imparting or somehow maintains jurisdiction for bishops or priests. So why isn't there a grappling with that?
Yes, it was a grave decision, and I think you can only say that, in hindsight, you can go back and analyze why he thought he felt the need to do that, how bad and universal the crisis in the church was, but that really, the practical disagreements with Rome were not, waiting for a date was not sufficient reason for him to delay the whole thing. And I think that's all you can say.
Right. So the excommunications themselves, obviously the society just continued doing its work. The bishops continued
which is not a good sign. Not a good sign.
Who were consecrated, began their ministries as you said, not with really jurisdiction, but doing what the confirmations and ordinations and things like that. So clearly they just didn't recognize that they were excommunicated, correct? I mean, they basically just were saying the excommunication itself was invalid.
Again, Luther thought until the day he died, he was still Catholic. He ripped up the bull Exsurge Domine, excommunicating him from Leo X. He just ripped it up. He felt like this is just a blast. A blast of wind. I don't have to abide by this. This isn't authentic. This isn't valid. Just because you don't recognize it doesn't mean much, because ultimately, who is the one who determines authoritatively whether or not somebody's excommunicated or not? The individual or Rome? If we're going to say the individual, well, upon what basis can you really criticize the Orthodox? I mean, just carry this to its logical conclusion.
Is that basically what they were arguing?
Yes. And again, for the historical record, you can go back and look at some studies that they had done even before the consecrations. Again, I think this all speaks to the fact that even if you don't agree with the archbishop or what they did at the time, there's no doubt they took it seriously. So they, all these studies about,
took it seriously, but that still doesn't take away from the fact it was still a schismatic act, and Rome is the one who determines that.
Well, can you do this canonically? And if so, how? What are some examples of history where
none?
Maybe, you had to consecrate bishops outside of papal, without papal mandate.
And every one of the instances I've seen people try to bring up are not equivalent, and they often misrepresent the historical context behind them, which is itself a problem. But again, appealing to canon law and things like that, who is the ultimate arbiter of canon law? Who promulgates canon law? The Pope. So that's why canon law itself notes that it's ultimately the Pope who interprets it, not the individual, and not the excommunicated, not the schismatic, not the lay faithful, not a local bishop. It's ultimately the Pope.
So in a way, they kind of anticipated that, well, if we do incur this excommunication for these reasons, we're already basically trying to invoke these principles and these canons, saying we're acting out of a state of necessity. And
necessity doesn't allow for them to do what they did. And so ultimately, there's still a problem there. Now, let's skip to the, well, actually, I'm going to share another clip here in just a moment, but let me just briefly talk about the 38-minute mark. It's brought up that the lifting of the 4 excommunications happened by Benedict XVI. That's certainly true. Benedict did lift the 4 excommunications of the illicit bishops. However, he still notes that the primary problem with the SSPX is not just one of regularizing them. It's not just one of canon law or liturgy. It's a doctrinal problem. That's why they haven't been regularized. Benedict XVI notes that in his letter to the bishops at the time where he lifted the excommunications. He says this is a doctrinal problem ultimately. That's something you often don't hear. There's a doctrinal problem with the Society of St. Pius X. Now, if you had to guess historically, do you go with Rome's doctrine or do you go with the people who are opposing Rome and their doctrine? Just think about it. You always err on the side of Rome. Why? Because it's ultimately Rome who is going to be responsible for the teaching authority of the church. So it's already a problem whenever you have now a doctrinal dispute between two groups. You're going to need to side with Rome if you're not going to take the Orthodox or Protestant route. Now, another point here is, yes, it's brought up that the 4 bishops who were excommunicated, those were lifted. However, Benedict ended up regretting one of those based on new information that he discovered after that. But it was also lifted because it was a good gesture on part of Rome, because they were hoping that they would be regularized soon. I imagine he probably would not have lifted those 4 excommunications, that is Benedict, if he had known that, no, that was going to fall through and they still haven't been regularized. It was an act of mercy on part of Rome. It was a good gesture on part of Rome, but it wasn't really reciprocated by the society. Moreover, it's not mentioned that Lefebvre is still excommunicated. That one wasn't lifted. Lefebvre's still excommunicated to this day. Maybe Rome will lift that one day. Maybe. It's possible. It certainly could. We have excommunicated people after they died. There have been people who died in communion, and we excommunicate them after they die. We did this with ecumenical councils, for crying out loud. We might question the prudence of that. Maybe so. But if we can excommunicate people who died in the peace of the church, we can certainly reverse an excommunication of somebody who died excommunicated after the fact that they are, after their death. We can certainly reverse that. So it's possible it could be reversed, but I'll point out that Benedict didn't reverse Lefebvre's excommunication. Why is that important? Because there are people today, including those who are in the society and others who are promoting the society, who see Lefebvre as a saint, and they want to use him as an example to resist the Church of Rome today. And I want to say you can't appeal to him because, number one, he's not only is he not canonized as a saint, he's still excommunicated. So probably not a good person to appeal to. But I thought it was interesting that that wasn't pointed out. Now, at the 38-minute and 40-second mark, Sammons says there are no excommunications on the table for those who go to the society. That's not exactly true. I know what he's saying. Like, if you just attend the Society of St. Pius X's chapel, a chapel, just attending in and of itself is not a schismatic act. And you're not excommunicated for that. No. However, if you formally adhere to the schism, you are excommunicated. In canon law, there's an automatic excommunication for the sin of schism, for the act of schism, I should say. Whether there's culpability is a different issue. But for the act of schism, there's an automatic excommunication. Rome has also said, if you formally adhere to the society, you're not in full communion. That is, you're in schism. So while it's somewhat true that one is not automatically excommunicated for somebody who just merely goes to a chapel, sure, but if you formally adhere to it, that's something else. I would say it's the exact same thing for the Eastern Orthodox. You go to an Orthodox liturgy, you're not automatically excommunicated. You're not automatically in schism. However, if you formally adhere to the Eastern Orthodox position, for instance, a denial of papal infallibility, supremacy, the filioque, whatever, you formally adhere to the Eastern Orthodox, you're in schism. Absolutely. You cannot formally adhere to the Eastern Orthodox position without being in schism. You're no longer in full communion with the Catholic Church. So again, just merely attending an Eastern Orthodox liturgy doesn't make you all of a sudden in schism, but formally adhering to it does. That's the same here. Why wasn't that brought up? I don't know. But that's the more substantive critique here. I've demonstrated that. Salza has demonstrated that. Many others have brought that up. Unfortunately, wasn't engaged. Now, between the 38, 50-second minute mark and 40-minute and 50-second minute mark, Sammons asks, can someone attend an SSPX chapel? Kind of related to what I just said. And I want to say attending is one thing. Formally adhering to the schism is another. It's a constant moving of the goalposts. It's a shifting of this discussion. The question isn't, can you attend a society chapel, here and there or something like that. That's not the question. The question is there a danger in frequenting an SSPX chapel because of the official position of the SSPX? That's one question. And then number two, can you formally adhere to the movement and still be in formal communion? That's the issue. Now, if you watch the video and go to the 50-minute mark, 50-minute to 53-minute, 15-second timestamp, Salmon asks, is the SSPX in schism? Now, Vogel doesn't address that Rome still says it's schismatic to formally adhere to the movement. That isn't addressed. It's just not addressed. Everything else is addressed. There's a ton of side issues that are addressed, but nothing that would take away from the fact that it's still the official position of Rome that if you formally adhere to it, you're not in full communion. It's schism. I would love for that to be grappled with, but go and watch that section and you'll notice that's entirely missing from the discussion. I'll also note that Sammons and Vogel raised the mentioning of the Pope in the canon of the liturgy of the SSPX as proof that there isn't really a schism here. Or at least that's the impression I got from Vogel, and it certainly sounded that way from Sammons. And look, one of the ways you can tell that someone is in full communion is through the mentioning of the Pope in the canon, but that in and of itself does not necessarily mean that you're in full communion. And I get where the mistake is. And in fact, it's brought up in the video. I see where the mistake is. Erick brings up the fact that in the first millennium, if somebody's mentioned in the diptychs, you're saying you're in communion with them. If they're struck from the diptychs, you're saying you're not in communion with them. And so the mentioning of the Pope's name in the canon is going to be a sure sign that the SSPX is in full communion. And I want to say that I could totally see that in the first millennium. But that doesn't apply here because, number one, we have a deeper definition of what is schism today than we did then, just in the same way we do have a more specific definition for what heresy is than they did back then. Number two, those who are celebrating the Roman rite, such as the SSPX, are within the jurisdiction, the patriarchate of the Bishop of Rome. They're in the Patriarch of the West. So it just simply saying, hey, I'm mentioning you in the liturgy. However, I'm completely disobeying you as to the way I'm operating. That's not going to work. Not only would that not work because the Pope universally has the ability to interfere in any jurisdiction and territory, but he also has that position just as the Patriarch of the West for those who are within his patriarchate. Now, again, it's a step forward. It's a good sign for a community to mention in their liturgy the name of the Pope. That's great. That again, that's a step closer. This is why I want to say the SSPX are closer to the fullness of the Catholic Church than the Eastern Orthodox for this reason alone. They're closer because you do have a mentioning of the Pope in the canon. At the very least, they're closer because of that. They're shy, just shy of being in full communion, you could argue. But it's that difference, however, that still says that there's a schism here. So while it's important to mention the Pope's name in the canon, that is not the only way to say I'm in full communion. To be in full communion is obedience to the Pope, and obedience here when it comes to matters of jurisdiction. And they're operating in a manner where they do not have the ability to operate in the way that they do. There is a lack of submission, as the definition of schism in the Code of Canon Law puts it. There is a lack of submission there, so there is an imperfection in their communion. Okay, so at the 57-minute mark, Salmon asks, is Vatican II a valid council in the eyes of the SSPX? And did it make any errors? Now, Vogel says, yes, it's a valid council. Great. But he also says it does have errors in it. And he specifically mentions Dignitatis Humanae, which, I'm sorry, not Dignitatis Humanae. The Declaration of Religious Liberty. Yeah. That is what he brought up. Yeah, let me double check. Yeah, he did specifically mention, I'm sorry, he did specifically mention Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration on Religious Liberty, and promulgated in 1965. I actually did a show just on Dignitatis Humanae earlier today with Catholic Answers, and it should be coming out in April. So certainly check it out, because we did address the question of the SSPX that was brought up, and also whether or not there have been any errors here or reversals. I did go over the Declaration of Religious Liberty from that angle there, so certainly look forward to it. But just kind of a sneak peek. He takes the position that Dignitatis Humanae errs, which that is the SSPX position, that there's an error there. There's an abandonment of the traditional teaching on the subject of religious liberty. And I'll say that I do not concede that there's an error there in Dignitatis Humanae. I don't concede that there's any kind of full contradictions between Vatican II and the preconciliar 19th century popes. However, even if there is, let's just pretend for the moment that there is some kind of irreconcilable difference on a point of doctrine here. First of all, why do we assume that it's the 19th century popes who got it right? Why do we assume that? We should probably challenge that. And then number two, they're asking the question, well, what do you do? You know, if there's an error here, what do you do? Because you have different levels of the magisterium. That's exactly what my dissertation is about. And this is partly one of the areas that I'm bringing up in the dissertation is Dignitatis Humanae. Long story short, what you would do if you have a contradiction here, it's already been demonstrated very well by Dr. King in his dissertation that the preconciliar 19th century popes were teaching non-definitively. It's also demonstrated quite effectively, and I think the SSPX would agree, that Vatican II was also teaching non-definitively on religious liberty. So here you have two instances of non-definitive teachings, both the preconciliar popes and Vatican II. Now, if there is a contradiction between them, which I don't concede there is, but if there is, you would have a contradiction between two non-definitive teachings. So now the question is, as they asked during the video, what do you do? Great question. You go to the one that outweighs the other. And this is, again, where Dr. King has done an incredible job in his dissertation, where he weighed the propositions of the 19th century popes and compared them to the weight of Vatican II's non-definitive teachings. And he shows that Vatican II outweighs the 19th century popes. So even if there isn't a harmonization, if there is a reversal here, you would give your assent to Vatican II rather than these preconciliar popes. Because Vatican II taught with a higher authority. So that was an important part of the discussion that I thought was interesting. They did not provide answers to it. Hopefully the answer that I just gave was sufficient and helpful. Now, let's go to another part. The 1 hour and 2 minute mark. And let's see, looking at my notes here. From about 102 to 104, you have Vogel, who says that Vatican II is mainly pastoral and disciplinary, more than doctrinal in nature. And I want to say this partly misunderstands what Vatican II, is referring to, or what we refer to about Vatican II when we speak of it being pastoral. Pastoral does not mean it's not doctrinal. You can have doctrine being presented pastorally. So actually, as John Courtney Murray rightly noted, Dignitatis Humanae is more doctrinal than anything. It is doctrinal in nature. Whether you like it or not, it's doctrinal. So just because it's pastoral doesn't mean it's not doctrinal. There's a lot of doctrine involved. And he mentions it's disciplinary in part, but again, a lot of the discipline hinges on doctrine in the council. So what I'm not hearing from Vogel is an engagement with how is it that we can fail to give a religious submission of intellect and will to Vatican II? Because if it is doctrinal in nature, which it is, then you can't simply discard the religious liberty document, Dignitatis Humanae. You can't just simply discard it. You would have to adhere to it with religious submission of intellect and will, all the more because, as it's already been demonstrated, Vatican II outweighs the 19th century popes, even if there is a reversal. Didn't hear any engagement with that. That's what we need to hear, however. Now, I want to go to another part of the video. Let me bring it back up because I accidentally closed it out. I'm going to go to the 106 42nd minute mark and wrap it up here. 106. Let's just start 106.32, somewhere around there, and it's till around 1 hour 14 minutes, where they're talking about the Novus Ordo. Let me share my screen and enable audio. Okay.
Council actually said, no, that's actually not true. So
Yeah.
clearly it's happened before on some level. And like you said,
Right.
it's trying to figure out what the level it matters. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about in general, though, is the Mass, the new Mass.
Yeah.
Novus Ordo, obviously, I think we all know that's kind of the raging debate. Now, it's been said, I hear it said often, that the SSPX basically tells their members, you may not attend the new Mass. And so the first question, is that true? And if it is, or if it isn't, what is kind of the SSPX position, so to speak, on the new Mass? Like, is it?
And I'm going to go over, after we play this clip, I'm going to go over a video, even though I've already gone over it before. I'm going to go over it again. You don't have to rely on people say this about the SSPX. No, we're not going to go with what people say. We're actually going to go straight to what the SSPX says. We're going to review that very briefly. But first, let's continue to watch them before I do that.
Valid and good and whatever.
Yeah. No, again, a fair question. I would clarify, just maybe for the sake of being pedantic, that, you know, when you say SSPX members, I'm thinking of this question more for even like the average guy in the pew hearing something from.
Yeah, I mean, and this was brought up earlier. Very technically, the members of the SSPX are priests, right? It's a priestly organization. So, but you do have other associations with the SSPX on part of, maybe religious or laity. But very technically, if we use the term member, it refers actually to the priest. You can't have like a lay member per se.
A society priest or
good
something
point. Yeah,
like
when
that.
I say members, isn't like an attendee at
Sure.
a chapel.
No, got it. Got it. So broadly speaking, yes, the society does not say the new Mass. They do consider it valid. And of course, if it's done by the books with the right intention, all the normal caveats, we obviously have a critique of the whole liturgical reform and a pretty, I would say, stringent one about the new Mass. And before I think I'll answer your question, but yes, broadly speaking, the society does not encourage people to go to the new Mass. And I think that
what we're about to see is an inadequate response, because I'm about to show you a video where the SSPX is saying more than just that. The SSPX is saying way more than just that.
It has to make sense in context, because I know that can sound shocking, especially if you just hear
that's not the shocking part.
That on its face. But I would say the approach is more like this. The liturgical reform has been a disaster, and it's been a disaster almost in every way at this point.
Yeah, we could do better. This is where I have some sympathies with SSPX. There might be a few things here and there that I think were good that came out of the liturgical reform, but on the whole, it's been pretty rough. Yeah, I agree with them.
And I would say that the problems, or let's say the reasons the society and others, go to the traditional Latin Mass or don't go to the new Mass are largely not one of preference. I think even you have had, or maybe you yourself have said, there is something more to stake than just what Mass I like. Either way, and for the society, it's twofold. I mean, there's the sense that you'll see again in the Ottaviani intervention. Part of the problem is that
which Ottaviani reversed his original assessment of the Novus Ordo, as I've demonstrated previously in the SSPX playlist.
The new Mass is set up in such a way that, as they would say, like it's the abuses and different ways it's celebrated are a feature, not a bug, right?
I don't agree with that at all. I vehemently disagree. I don't think that there's anything inherently in the Novus Ordo, even with its various options, that allows for it for abuse or sacrilege or anything like that. No. However, one legitimate critique we can offer about the Novus Ordo here, among many, actually, there's a lot of critiques I make about the Novus Ordo, but among one of them is Is it really wise to have various options in an environment that's filled with liturgical abuse? Is that really a good idea? Probably not. Probably not. Is it really a good idea to have other canons than the Roman canon when we're already in an environment that is practically divorced from the historical roots of the Roman Rite? Probably not a good idea, right? Shouldn't it be better to just have one canon, that is the Roman canon, to show more continuity with a Missal of 62? Yeah. Is it legitimate to have multiple canons? Of course it is. However, is it the best idea in today's environment? Probably not. Probably not. Is it a good idea to have the option between versus populum and ad orientem? Not in today's environment, not when we're already struggling with maintaining and preserving our roots. Not a good idea. So this is where I think a legitimate critique can be made of the Roman Rite without going to the extreme of the SSPX, which we're going to see in a moment. And unfortunately, we don't hear it very clearly from James. And I kind of wonder why.
You get really on the ground when you ask a question like this. Can you go to the new mass? Realistically, the question is, well, which new mass, right? I mean, it's
the one that is celebrated properly. That's the one we're talking about. We're not talking about abuses. We all agree if there's like severe abuses to the Novus Ordo, everybody in this discussion is in agreement. You don't have an obligation to go to that. And if that's the only option you have, you don't have an obligation to go. Everybody's in agreement there. I don't know anybody who says, yeah, you got to go to a clown mass. Who takes that position? Nobody takes that position. What we're talking about is the SSPX saying that even a properly celebrated mass, one should not go to? We're going to see the answer very clearly here from the SSPX itself, which I'm about to show, but I'll finish out this clip.
It's almost different everywhere you go. So there's that aspect to it, but really the problem at its root is that even though, yes, it is open to abuses and we reject things like communion in the hand and other sacrileges.
Communion in the hand is not sacrilegious in and of itself. There are some ways in which it's been done that's sacrilegious, conceded, but abuse doesn't take away proper use, as Augustine would note. You can't call communion in the hand sacrilegious when it's apostolic. Jesus and the apostles practiced this. You can't call it sacrilegious when this is the venerable tradition of the first millennium. It was rare to have another form. It was rare to have communion on the tongue or some liturgical spoon or some other tradition that we have. That was rare. The predominant way and mode of reception was communion in the hand. I've done multiple videos on this. I go over the primary sources, secondary sources. This is a non-negotiable. This isn't disputed. It's a historical fact. You can't call that which was sacred, as Benedict once said, right? That which was sacred in the past, you can't all of a sudden be considered sacrilege. That's true here as well. You can't call communion in the hand sacrilege unless he's referring to an abuse of communion in the hand, but he didn't make that proper qualification. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. He's speaking off the cuff. It happens. I do it. Sometimes I don't properly qualify things. I can totally understand it. It happens. But that needs to be said, because if we're saying communion in the hand itself is sacrilege, which a lot of people are saying today, that's 100% wrong. That would be to accuse the apostles and the fathers of the first millennium, Augustine and Ambrose and numerous others, of sacrilege. That's going too far. That being said, is communion in the hand a good idea today? As I've said many, many times, in an environment that doesn't respect the real presence, where we already have a lot of abuses, no, it's not a good idea. It's not. So while we might say in and of itself there's nothing wrong with it, is it the best decision today? Probably not. I don't think in the Roman Rite we should have communion in the hand presently. I don't think we're responsible enough for that. Maybe we can talk about it if we were more responsible, but we're just not responsible. We're too careless. And there's too many people who don't believe in the real presence for that to be a good idea. It would be a better idea to have communion on the tongue in the Roman Rite for those reasons. So while I want to say there are some legitimate criticisms here, this seemingly goes too far.
The real debate comes down to whether the new rite of Mass explicitly and appropriately expresses notions that are supposed to be intrinsic to what a Catholic Mass is supposed to express, notions like sacrifice and propitiation. So if it's true that some of the prayers of the Missal are, let's say, defective, they're not as clear and Catholic as they should be, and if it's also true that, you know, lex orandi, lex credendi, then yeah, that's why if you look at it through that
and I challenge this. I don't believe that the liturgy itself, the rubrics, the text itself is somehow deficient, inadequate, defective. Might we say it could better stress some things? Of course. But I could say that about a lot of things. Your average Catholic today, if you were to start probing them on Christology, a lot of Catholics are probably heterodox. I doubt very seriously if you started probing. Even in the preconciliar church, the average TLM Missal of 62 or whatever attendee, Missal of 55, preconciliar, attendee, you started quizzing them on Christology, you'd probably hear a whole bunch of them being Nestorian and all kinds of stuff. Is there a sufficient explanation of some Christological issues in the liturgy? Probably not. Is it somehow defective in Christology? No. Could we emphasize some things more in the liturgy? Yeah, probably. But it doesn't logically follow that somehow makes it defective.
Context, if it's not a question of preference, and there is something actually in the Mass that is the Missal, to be clear, in the Missal that is deficient, then
you hear what he's saying. He's saying this isn't just an issue of preference, it's the Missal itself that's defective, which that is the SSPX position, which is actually worse than what James is saying. James is giving you the very nice, polished version. I'm about to show you the SSPX that's going to give you the really bad presentation and version and show you the good, bad, and the ugly.
Then yeah, why would we advise you to go to that? I think that's the approach, if it makes sense.
So
why would we advise you to go to that?
Even if there's nothing else available. So
listen to the context, even if there's nothing else available. And we're talking in the context not of abuses. He's talking about the Missal itself. Remember the context, the Missal itself. So he's not talking about sacrilegious, abusive liturgies. We all agree you don't have to go to those. He's talking about the Missal itself. So properly celebrated Novus Ordos. And Erick's now asking, well, what if that's your only option?
So let's say we're talking about somebody, the only Mass within, let's say, 3 hours is the new Mass. And let's say it's even one that we would say, at least on its surface, is celebrated properly.
Yeah. Again, the context is celebrated properly.
Not clown Mass, not something crazy.
Yep, not sacrilegious.
You know, the priest is trying his best to follow the Missal. And would, even in that case, would the recommendation just be to stay home rather than attend the new Mass in that situation?
And the video we're about to see is going to answer it very clearly. But James, I think, does tell us the answer here.
I think so, because
I think so.
All individual circumstances aside, and to be clear, I'm not talking about questions of culpability or anything like that. But I mean, really what you're asking is, well, I'll say this. I think everyone, let's say everyone who's a conservative or a traditional Catholic ends up drawing these kinds of lines somewhere when it comes to Mass attendance. I remember something of this myself when my family was coming to the old Mass. So at first, maybe it's like, well, we're not going to go to that parish church because that priest says crazy things from the pulpit. We're going to drive over here. The Mass is better over here.
Yeah, that's not a question. Like heresy being preached, you don't have an obligation. You don't have an obligation to go that's not a question here. The question was in the context of a good Mass properly celebrated. That was the context.
And then for some people, it's communion in the hand. And so you do draw these kind of lines.
Communion in hand, meaning the venerable apostolic practice of the first millennium. Again, there's nothing wrong in and of itself.
And it's kind of goofy. My argument is more that I say the society just draws the line a little bit further and says, well, I mean, the problem's in the Mass itself. So if it's true that if there are problems,
the problem is in the Mass itself.
in the missal itself, then yeah, even in these theoretical best case scenarios, I mean, I think the society's advice would be not to go.
I think the society advice would be not to go, even in the best case scenario. I'm about to show you whether or not that's the case. We don't have to think. The answer is, yeah, the society says don't go. It's an offense to God in the context of a properly celebrated liturgy. But, I thought, what? James is in a tough position here anyway. He's the director of communications. Is he really going to be able to publicly say, yeah, I think that the society officially goes too far here? He's not going to say that. So he obviously maintains the party line position of the SSPX, which is the missal itself is defective. It's Protestant and modernist in some areas. Therefore, it's an offense to God. It has poison in it. These are their words, not mine. It's an offense to God. It has poison in it. And therefore, for those who know better and know that it's an offense to God, they cannot go to the Novus Ordo, unless it's a case where they have to attend for like a wedding or a funeral. And in that case, you can only passively attend it as long as there's no danger of scandal. So you can't actively participate. They're treating the Novus Ordo as if it's a non-Catholic rite.
It's interesting.
You would say that the obligation to attend Sunday Mass, which is obviously binding and mortal sin if you don't attend Mass when you can, you would say essentially that it's not obviously a situation of geographic or physical inability to attend.
Moral impossibility. I mean,
but is there a moral impossibility here? The answer is no. They're literally saying that the church has imposed a liturgy and officially promulgated it that you're morally unable to attend. They're not talking about abuses. They're talking about what's officially promulgated. That's a very dangerous position. So what this translates into is misleading souls, telling them not to go to a good and healthy liturgy where our Lord is given to them. They're saying, don't go, stay at home and pray the rosary. That's keeping people estranged from the sacraments. And not only just with, again, the Mass, but also confession.
I mean, I think, well, yeah, because broadly speaking, because it's true. I mean, obviously the first and primary duty is to keep the Lord's Day holy. And the normative way we do that as Catholics is attending Mass.
Yeah. Does the Novus Ordo not keep the day holy? I mean, is that the argument here?
But I think everyone's broadly familiar with the exceptions that do exist. If you're sick, if you do have to travel, if there is.
That wasn't the context of the question. Nobody's talking about if you're sick, if you have to travel. We're not talking about that. Notice we're shifting the parameters of the discussion from the original question.
Yeah, moral impossibility for different reasons to attend, then you're not.
What moral impossibility is there to attend a properly celebrated liturgy promulgated by the church? What moral possibility is there? The one that they maintain is, well, it is infected with Protestantism and modernism. That's a doctrinal claim. It's a doctrinal claim that the church has basically promulgated a heretical liturgy. That's the claim. That's a problem, as I've demonstrated many, many times.
You're not obliged to. You're still obliged to keep the Lord's Day holy. You're not obliged to attend Mass. And I think that is, if you want to talk about sort of, principles of jurisprudence, when you look at the canonical side of this, I don't think, I wish I could remember the Latin saying, but there's no obligation in cases of doubt, right? It's not exactly.
Okay. Are we to really doubt something officially promulgated by the church? Is there sufficient grounds to doubt that? The answer is no. So I'm not discussing a person's personal culpability if they doubt, but the question is, are there legitimate grounds to doubt the attendance of a Novus Ordo properly celebrated, officially promulgated by the church? The answer is no. There's no justifiable grounds for that. The SSPX is wrong here. And so whereas I want to say guys like James, really nice people, there's a lot of nice people who go to the SSPX. But I can also say the same thing of some of my Protestant friends, Eastern Orthodox friends. There's a lot of nice people there. But at the end of the day, what Protestantism is saying, it can certainly in some cases be harmful to souls. What Eastern Orthodoxy says in some cases, certainly harmful to souls. What the SSPX is saying in some cases, this is an example where I think it's harmful to souls. This is why I think we can't just bypass these issues and sweep them under the rug we need to bring this out in the open and really press the SSPX on this issue.
Exactly how it's phrased. We can get the right phrase in Latin, but it can't be the subject of an obligation if it's, well, look, it's my only option, and yeah, I know I'm going to see really bad things. I know that's
I'm going to see really bad things from something officially promulgated by the church that's properly celebrated. We're not talking about Novus Ordo abuses. Remember, the context of the question was properly celebrated, the best expression of the Novus Ordo, which would mean like a John Cantius version of the Novus Ordo, even, with a ton of Latin, ad orientem, Gregorian chant, full of piety. That's an offense to God. That's something that you need to run away from. People want to say, oh, that's a unicorn mass. You know what? It's actually a little bit more common than you might think. But even if that is a unicorn mass, but still, there's plenty of them that are properly celebrated and good and holy, and they're not an offense to God. The SSPX is saying, no, that's still an offense to God. You can't attend those things. That's dangerous. But notice, again, a shifting of the discussion here.
I'm going to hear un-Catholic things, and yet I have to go because it's the only way I can fulfill my obligation.
Hear un-Catholic things from an official liturgy? What in the Missal itself is un-Catholic? Nothing. So you see how they have to set up a straw man to really maintain this position? We shifted the discussion from the Missal itself all of a sudden to a straw man.
I don't think it takes away at all the very real suffering that people go through trying to find a reverent liturgy, because
actually, I think finding a reverent Novus Ordo is not hard. That's not hard. Finding an ideal Novus Ordo, yeah, that might be a little harder. But finding a legitimate, properly celebrated Novus Ordo, that's not hard. So I reject the straw man here. And James himself has noted that the Novus Ordo he attended when he was younger wasn't that bad. It wasn't anything majorly sacrilegious. It's so funny. Every SSPX apologist I hear, they say that they used to go to the Novus Ordo, which wasn't that bad. It wasn't that bad of a Novus Ordo. Every one of them says that. It's so interesting. Okay. If it wasn't that bad, might that also be the case for a lot of people today? There's a lot of Novus Ordos that they're really not that bad. They're actually done relatively decently. But no, we can't go to those because it's an offense to God for the SSPX.
At the end, I think it should be clear that all of the particular things we're talking about, as important as they are, they need to be seen in the bigger context, which is the liturgy. The Mass is not primarily something for us. It is the public worship of God.
Absolutely. And it's not an offense to God. And by the way, here's the even bigger picture. The even bigger picture is the SSPX is making a claim that something officially promulgated by the church is an offense to God and is infected with heresy and poison. That's the bigger picture. And an even bigger picture is they're operating in schism, and they're operating in disobedience, and they're operating outside of the jurisdiction of the church in many instances, even if Pope Francis has granted faculties in some cases for the mercy of the people who go and attempt to receive those sacraments, not to somehow justify the SSPX and make it canonical, but just simply for the fact that people, otherwise their confessions wouldn't be valid, their marriages wouldn't be valid. There's still a remaining problem, however. They also do talk earlier in the video about, well, there's cases where they're operating in conjunction with the local bishop. Yeah, that's great. In cases where they're operating in conjunction with the local bishop, I don't really have a criticism, unless they're starting to say something heretical in that territory. I don't really have a criticism of if the local bishop allows for the chapel. You don't get an argument from me other than what they're just saying on a larger level. That is that the liturgy is an offense to God. Don't go to Novus Ordo confessions. I still have those criticisms. But if a local bishop is allowing it in his diocese, okay, cool. But in the vast majority of cases, they're not. They're prohibiting them, and they're still operating in those territories. So they try to make it out as if they're really working in conjunction with the bishop. But that's exceptional. In the vast majority of cases, they're in disobedience to the local bishop and to Rome ultimately. All right, wrapping it up here, let me show you very briefly this video from the Society of St. Pius X that's going to give you an even more clear answer than what we just heard from James. It's called Should Catholics Attend the New Mass? This is SSPX News English. It's been up for 7 years now. 46,000 people have watched it. This is part 2 of 2. Let's begin here.
that the new Mass, even when said with piety and respect for the liturgical rules, is subject to reservations, since it is impregnated with the spirit of Protestantism.
This is from Lefebvre himself. This is why they can't get away from what is in their roots. You can't get away from it because it's in their founder. What's in the roots, as I say, will find its way to its branches. And here's what the root says. That is Lefebvre, taken from his open letter to confused Catholics. The new Mass, even when said with piety, so not abuses, the new Mass properly celebrated with piety and respect for the liturgical rules is subject to reservations since it's impregnated with the spirit of Protestantism. But it gets worse.
It bears within it a poison harmful to the faith.
The Missal itself, the liturgy itself, properly celebrated per Lefebvre, is poisonous. We didn't hear that in the interview, oddly enough. Poisonous. Does the SSPX no longer agree with that? Well, it seems that they agree with it because they're putting out this video. So you hear that, Father? You who celebrates the Novus Ordo with piety, you have a poisonous liturgy.
Unquote. With the deficiencies in the rite itself, Archbishop Lefebvre also pointed out the danger to the faith coming from bad preaching and liturgical abuses.
Yeah, we all agree on that one. I mean, sure. Faulty preaching, heretical preaching, liturgical abuses. No argument there. We all agree with that. But remember, the context was properly celebrated liturgy.
In itself, the rite of the new Mass does not clearly express the faith.
In itself, not abuses, in itself, it does not clearly express the faith. Really? Do we really want to carry that to its logical conclusion?
Precisely on the points of doctrine denied by the Protestant heresies.
What about the points of doctrine denied by the Oriental Orthodox or the Eastern Orthodox? Is it always just expressly clear on every single point on those things? Oh, I think that the liturgy is not defective, both in the pre-conciliar era and post-conciliar era. But could we maybe maximize some things? Could we beef some things up a little bit more? Yeah, sure. That doesn't mean that the liturgy, either pre-conciliar or post, is somehow defective in these areas. No, I don't take that position.
In itself, therefore, this new rite of the Mass constitutes a danger to souls.
It's a danger to souls. That which is officially promulgated by the Church, properly celebrated with piety, according to the rubrics per the SSPX, is a danger to souls. Do you see why there's a problem here with the SSPX? It gets worse.
It is a fact that this new liturgy has confused or destroyed the faith of millions of Catholics.
It is not a fact. It is, however, a fact that there have been much confusion and chaos since the 60s and 70s. Yeah, sure. But is it because of the new liturgy? No. Just because something comes at this time doesn't mean it's because of that thing. There were many other factors going on in society in the 60s and 70s that caused a lot of confusion, not just a reform of the liturgy. So I don't accept that fact.
Since the 1970s.
Mass attendees decreased by 60% since 1965 to 2000. Post hoc ergo propter hoc argument is what this fallacy is known as. Yeah, absolutely. But not just because of somehow there's this defective liturgy, not because of that, but because of all the chaos going on in society, all of the liberalism in society, which was prior to really the reform of the liturgy. These things were already stirring up in society prior to the Second Vatican Council.
To the point that most churchgoers today have an erroneous understanding of the Catholic doctrine of the Mass and sometimes do not even believe in the real presence.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's not because of the Novus Ordo itself. Could there be things that we do in the Novus Ordo that strengthen the real presence? Yes, as I argue, absolutely. But it's not because of the Novus Ordo itself that people disbelieve somehow in the real presence. And moreover, I would just say, I wish we could take a poll of the Christology of the pre-conciliar Catholics. I bet it would be horrendous. I guarantee you the vast majority of Catholics prior to Vatican II could not give you a solid articulation of Christology as expressed by the first 7 ecumenical councils. Guarantee it. Guarantee it. Why? Not because the liturgy is defective, but because catechesis could always be better. That's why.
The Church cannot ask her members to endanger their faith. This is the reason.
endanger their faith to attend something promulgated by the church? The church is giving you something dangerous to your faith when it's properly celebrated with piety and holiness? Do you hear this?
Why Catholics are not obliged to attend the new Mass to fulfill the Sunday precept. In fact, for those who have knowledge of its inherent problems, the new Mass is to be completely avoided.
It's not just recommended that you not attend, as we heard from the interview. It's actually you should completely avoid it. You shouldn't go to it. For if you know better, you don't go to it. If you know it's an offense to God, don't go to it. If you know it's poisonous, you can't go to it.
As they understand that it is also an offense to God.
And there you had it. The Novus Ordo, properly celebrated, done with piety and reverence according to the rubrics, is an offense to God per the SSPX. That's where the problem really is. Did we hear any grappling with those kinds of substantive critiques against the SSPX in the video that we just saw? No, it wasn't there. All of the softballs were addressed, but the more substantive critiques against the SSPX just go unchallenged. I'll note James never mentioned that part, that it's an offense to God. He's a little bit more diplomatic than this video.
When a traditional Mass is not available, or when the faith is endangered by the preaching or opinions of the priest, one is dispensed from attending Mass on a Sunday or...
Of course, if preaching endangers the faith and that's all you have, yeah, you're dispensed. No argument there. But they're saying, look, even in the context of the Novus Ordo properly celebrated, if you know that this is an offense to God, you can't go.
Or Holy Day. In such cases, the Church recommends the faithful to sanctify Sunday by dedicating a time for prayer, alone or in the family. One could read the Mass of the day, pray the Rosary, and make a spiritual communion.
So keep people away from the sacraments, keep them away from Christ Jesus in the Eucharist because of a faulty critique against the Novus Ordo. That's what's happening here. People are told, stay at home, pray your rosary, don't receive sacramental grace, don't be united further to Christ through sacramental grace and Holy Communion through a good liturgy. No, this stuff is harmful to souls. It's impious. It's infected with Protestantism and poison. Stay at home and pray your rosary if this is all you have available to you. That's the recommendation you're getting from the SSPX. And again, as I've shown elsewhere, it's even worse with confessions. They're saying, no, basically, you have to stay in mortal sin until you can find somebody who's a good traditional confessor. Don't go to Novus Ordo confessions in the vast majority of cases is what they're telling you. So stay in mortal sin and yeah, say your act of contrition. Maybe you can get out of your mortal sin that way, but don't go to that Novus Ordo confession for the absolution of your sins. No, hold off on that until you get to a traditional priest. This is dangerous stuff, and it's unfortunately not addressed in the interview, and that's my critique with it. So while I can appreciate some aspects of it, I can also appreciate the diplomacy of James Vogel, and I can also appreciate Erick Sammons doing his best to offer some pushback there. Yeah, but at the end of the day, did this really move the discussion forward? No, it did not advance the discussion forward in any way because substantive critiques have already been made against the SSPX, which still go unaddressed. And those are the ones that really need to be addressed. So until then, it's not going to move forward. The discussion is just going to continue to be where it is. Substantive critiques have been offered, and we're not hearing sufficient engagement in response, unfortunately. Okay, so anyways, I hope y'all enjoyed this and benefited from it. If you did, hit the like button and the subscribe button. Please help me grow this channel by hitting the subscribe button. Also hit the bell for notifications so you know when I go live. And lastly, check me out at patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support me here and what I'm doing. We'll see you later. God bless.
Are you confused about how Catholic teaching authority works? With encyclicals, papal bulls, councils, and many other things, it's easy to get confused on what is authoritative and what is not. Fortunately, at MaximusInstitute.com, I have prepared a course explaining the magisterium from A to Z. Visit the website and check out the course Understanding the Magisterium for more information.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause, call them now.
Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. God bless.